The dinner rush at Silver Crown always looked the same. Soft jazz floating through the air, crystal glasses catching the light, laughter polished and controlled. It was the kind of place where problems were meant to stay outside, along with rain, noise, and people who didn't belong. Ethan Carter stood near table 12, holding a tray with steady hands that betrayed none of the exhaustion in his bones. He was 34, tall but slightly stooped, his shoulders carrying more than just plates. His white shirt was clean but worn thin at the cuffs, his tie knotted with care despite having been retied too many times that night. This was his second double shift of the week. Every step he took was measured, not because the floor was slippery, but because every tip mattered. Tonight's tips weren't for himself. They were for Lily. His 6-year-old daughter had asthma, the kind that stayed quiet until it didn't. The inhaler on the kitchen counter at home was nearly empty, and the pharmacy reminder sat unread on his phone like a quiet threat. Rent was due next week. School lunch fees, too. Ethan had learned to stack worries the way he stacked dishes. Carefully, silently, so nothing would fall. "Dad, are you working late again?" Lily had asked that morning, her voice small but brave. "Just a little, Peanut," he'd said, forcing a smile. "I'll be home before you know it." Now, hours later, his feet ached, his back burned, but he kept moving. Polite, attentive, invisible. Around him, guests in tailored suits and elegant dresses spoke about stocks, vacations, things Ethan only heard about on TV. They barely looked at him, except when they needed something. And that was fine. He didn't need to be seen. He just needed to get through the night. As he passed the entrance, the door opened again. A woman stepped inside, small, gray-haired, wrapped in a faded coat that looked far too thin for the cold outside. She hesitated, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for someone, or something familiar. The hostess stiffened. Conversations nearby slowed. Ethan noticed the way the woman clutched her purse, the way her shoulders drew inward, bracing for impact. He felt it then, a quiet tightening in his chest. Something about her didn't belong to the world of chandeliers and polished silver, and somehow, neither did he. At the far end of the room, the night manager started walking toward her, his expression already sharp, already impatient. Ethan paused. He didn't know why his feet stopped moving. He only knew that sometimes, before a life changes, there's a moment so small you almost miss it. A breath held, a choice waiting to be made. The woman took 2 tentative steps inside Silver Crown, then stopped. The warmth of the restaurant wrapped around her like something unfamiliar. Too bright, too clean, too expensive. Her coat was of faded navy wool, the kind that had seen many winters and been mended more than once. Her shoes were sensible but worn, soles thin, edges scuffed. She held her purse close to her chest, fingers tight around the strap as if it were the only thing anchoring her. Her name was Margaret Hale, though no one in the room knew that. At the hostess stand, the young woman glanced up, her practiced smile faltering for half a second. Nearby conversation softened, voices lowering, not out of concern but curiosity. A ripple passed through the room, subtle but unmistakable. Margaret cleared her throat. "I'm meeting my daughter," she said quietly. "She asked me to wait here." Before the hostess could respond, a sharp voice cut in. "Ma'am, so..." Mark Reynolds, the night manager, was already striding toward her, his expression tight and irritated, as if her presence alone were a disruption. His suit was crisp, his posture rigid with authority borrowed from the building around him. "This is a private dining establishment," Mark said, lowering his voice just enough to sound polite, but not kind. "We don't allow loitering." Margaret blinked, confused. "I'm not loitering, I'm just waiting. She'll be here soon." Mark's eyes flicked over her. Coat, shoes, purse, then hardened. "Our guests are paying customers. If you're not dining, I'll have to ask you to leave." A few heads turned away, suddenly very interested in their menus. No one spoke. No one intervened. Margaret's shoulders slumped slightly, her cheeks flushed with a quiet, painful embarrassment. She nodded once as if accepting a verdict she'd heard before in other places, other moments of her life. "I can wait outside," she murmured. Across the room, Ethan Carter stood frozen near the service station, his tray still in his hands. He watched the exchange, the sharpness in Mark's tone, the way the woman shrank inward, the silence that followed like permission. Ethan felt the same tightening in his chest from moments earlier, stronger now. He thought of his mother, long gone. He thought of Lily, waiting at home, trusting him to do the right thing, even when it was hard. Margaret coughed softly, her lips dry. No one offered her water. Ethan glanced down at the glass pitcher beside him, and in that instant, he knew. This wasn't just about a woman who didn't belong. It was about who decided who mattered. Ethan didn't think. If he had, he might have stayed still. Instead, he set the tray down slowly and reached for a clean glass. His hands moved on instinct, the way they always did when someone needed something simple: water, bread, a moment to breathe. He filled the glass from the pitcher, added a single ice cube, then hesitated before stepping out from behind the service station. Margaret stood near the entrance now, half turned toward the door, as if preparing herself for the cold outside. Her shoulders were tense, her breathing shallow. When she coughed again, it sounded dry, brittle. "Ma'am," Ethan said gently. She startled, looking up at him with tired, wary eyes. For a moment, she looked ready to apologize just for being there. "Here," Ethan continued, holding out the glass. "You look like you could use some water." Margaret stared at it, then at him. Her hands trembled as she took the glass, fingertips brushing his. "Thank you," she said softly. Her voice carried relief and surprise. She took a small sip, then another. Color returned to her face just a little. Behind them, a chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Hey!" Mark's voice cut through the room, sharp and unmistakable. He strode over, eyes locked on the glass in Margaret's hand, like it was evidence of a crime. "What do you think you're doing?" he snapped at Ethan. "Did I tell you to play host?" Ethan straightened. "She just needed some water." "This isn't a shelter," Mark said, lowering his voice but not his anger. "Our guests don't come here to watch charity cases." A few diners glanced over, then quickly looked away. Mark turned to Margaret. "I asked you to leave." Margaret's grip tightened on the glass. "I was just—" Mark reached out and took the glass from her hand, setting it down hard on a nearby table. Water sloshed over the rim, spilling onto the polished surface. "That's enough," he said. "Out, now." Margaret stepped back, stunned. Her eyes dropped to the floor, shame settling over her like a heavy coat. Ethan felt something snap inside his chest. He thought of Lily again, of how she looked at him when she needed help, trusting he wouldn't turn away. He took a breath. Then he spoke. "Sir," Ethan said, his voice steady but firm, "she's not hurting anyone." Mark's eyes narrowed. "You're already on thin ice," he warned. "Don't make it worse." Ethan didn't answer. But he didn't move away either. Mark's jaw tightened. He looked at Ethan the way a man looks at a problem he intends to crush quickly. "You want to defend her?" Mark said. "Fine. Then you can pay for the disruption." He nodded toward the table where the water had spilled. A thin crack ran through the rim of the glass, barely visible, but real. "That glass isn't cheap," Mark continued. "Neither is the time you've wasted. You break the rules, you cover the cost." Ethan followed his gaze. The glass, the water, such a small thing. Yet it suddenly felt heavier than everything in his pockets combined. "I'll take care of it," Ethan said quietly. He reached into his apron and pulled out a folded stack of bills, creases soft from being counted too many times. Tonight's tips, Lily's medicine, the inhaler, the grocery list taped to the fridge. He hesitated for half a second. Then he placed the money on the table. Mark's eyebrows lifted, surprised despite himself. "That's not all," Mark added coldly. "You escorted her in. You escort her out." Margaret looked between them, eyes wide. "No, please," she whispered. "I don't want to cause trouble." "You're not," Ethan said gently, turning to her. "It's okay." He picked up the cash, what little was left, and guided her toward the door. The room felt colder now, heavier. No one stopped them. No one said a word. Outside, the night air hit hard and sharp. Margaret shivered. Ethan slipped off his jacket without thinking and draped it over her shoulders. Then he raised his hand, flagging down a taxi that slowed at the curb. He opened the door for her and placed the remaining bills into the driver's hand. "Please," Ethan said, "take her home safe." Margaret stared at him, tears filling her eyes. "You didn't have to do this." Ethan smiled, tired but sincere. "Yeah," he said softly. "I did." The taxi pulled away, taillights disappearing into the dark. Ethan stood there a moment longer, his pockets empty, the cold seeping in. His phone vibrated. A message from Lily's school nurse lit up the screen. Reminder, inhaler refill overdue. Ethan closed his eyes. Then he turned back toward the glowing doors of the restaurant, knowing exactly what waited for him inside, and walking toward it anyway. Ethan didn't go back inside right away. He stood beneath the restaurant's awning, the warmth from inside fading fast, his breath visible in the cold night air. His jacket was gone. His pockets were empty. For the first time in hours, there was nothing left to carry. No plates, no tray, no tips. Just the weight of what he'd done. His phone vibrated again. "Dad?" Lily's voice came through the speaker, small and already tired. The sound of it hit him harder than Mark's threats ever could. "Hey, Peanut," Ethan said, forcing his voice to stay steady. "How you feeling?" There was a pause, a shallow inhale. "My chest feels funny," she admitted. "Mrs. Collins helped me with the blue inhaler, but it's almost empty." Ethan closed his eyes. "That's okay," he said softly. "You did the right thing. I'll take care of it, I promise." "But you said tonight we'd stop at the pharmacy," Lily said. Not accusing, just hopeful. "I know," Ethan whispered. His throat tightened. "I'm still working on it." Silence hung between them, filled with things neither of them wanted to say out loud. "Daddy?" Lily asked. "Yeah? Did you help someone today?" Ethan swallowed. "I think I did." "Mom would have liked that," Lily said gently. Her words cracked something open inside him. He pressed his palm against the cold brick wall, steadying himself. "I'll be home soon," he told her. "Make sure you stay warm." After the call ended, Ethan stared at the dark screen. He felt fear now, real fear. Not for himself, but for the little girl waiting in a quiet apartment, trusting him to make things right. Behind him, the restaurant doors swung open. Warm light spilled onto the sidewalk. And with it came footsteps. Ethan straightened, knowing this moment, the one he couldn't delay any longer, had finally arrived. The footsteps stopped just behind Ethan. "Excuse me." The voice was calm, controlled, soft enough to be polite, sharp enough to command attention without trying. Ethan turned. Victoria Hale stood there, framed by the warm glow of the restaurant's entrance. She wore a tailored charcoal coat, elegant in a way that didn't beg to be noticed but always was. Her posture was straight, her expression unreadable, eyes observant and cool. People inside Silver Crowns shifted the moment they saw her. Conversations lowered, staff straightened. Even Mark's sharp voice vanished mid-sentence. Victoria Hale didn't raise her voice. She never needed to. "I'm looking for the night manager," she said. Mark appeared instantly, smoothing his tie, his earlier arrogance replaced by a brittle smile. "Ms. Hale, I wasn't expecting—" "I'm here now," Victoria replied, cutting him off without raising her tone. Her eyes moved past him, settling on Ethan. "What's going on?" Mark spoke quickly, rehearsed. One of the servers overstepped, brought in a non-paying individual, disrupted the atmosphere. Victoria studied Ethan the way an appraiser studies an object, thorough, detached. "Is that true?" she asked. Ethan met her gaze, his heart pounded, but his voice didn't shake. "I gave a woman water," he said. "She needed it." Silence followed. Victoria nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "We're not a charity." "I know," Ethan replied, "but she's a person." Mark exhaled sharply. "Ms. Hale, we can't afford this kind of sentiment." Victoria didn't look at him. "No," she said calmly. "We can't afford inconsistency." Her eyes returned to Ethan. "You were hired to follow policy, not rewrite it." Ethan felt the finality in her words before she spoke them. "Turn in your apron," Victoria said, "effective immediately." The door behind her remained open, warm and bright. But for Ethan, the night had just gone cold. He removed the apron slowly, folded it with care, and placed it on the stand beside him. Then he looked at her one last time, not angry, not pleading, just tired, and walked away. Victoria Hale remained at the entrance long after Ethan disappeared into the dark. Inside Silver Crown, the rhythm of the evening tried to recover. Glasses clinked. A server laughed a little too loudly. Someone restarted the jazz playlist. On the surface, everything returned to normal. But something felt off. Victoria moved through the dining room with slow, deliberate steps. Staff parted instinctively. Mark followed half a step behind, eager, nervous. "Has my mother arrived yet?" Victoria asked without looking at him. Mark blinked. "Your mother? No, ma'am, I didn't see—" Victoria stopped. Her mother was never late. Not once in the past 10 years. She didn't forget. She didn't wander. She always arrived early and waited quietly, usually with a book she never really read. Victoria checked her phone. No missed calls, no messages. She frowned and dialed. "Ring. Ring." No answer. A faint tension settled in her chest, unfamiliar and unwelcome. She told herself it was nothing. Traffic, a dead phone battery, 100 reasonable explanations. Still, her gaze drifted. back toward the entrance, toward the place where the old woman had stood earlier, toward the server who'd been fired for giving her water. "Mark," Victoria said slowly, "who was the woman you removed tonight?" Mark stiffened. "Just some confused elderly lady. Didn't belong here." Victoria turned to face him fully now. "What did she say?" Victoria asked. Mark hesitated. "She said she was waiting for her daughter." Something clicked. Victoria's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She walked toward the security corridor without another word. Mark hurried after her, suddenly uneasy. "Ms. Hale, the cameras—" "I know where they are," Victoria said. Inside the security room, the screens glowed softly in the dim light. Victoria leaned forward, fingers moving with practiced precision. She rewound the footage. And there she was. A small woman in a faded coat clutching her purse, standing alone, being spoken to sharply. Victoria felt a chill crawl up her spine. She recognized that posture, that coat. "Mom?" she whispered. The room felt very, very quiet. And for the first time that night, Victoria Hale felt something crack beneath her perfectly controlled exterior. A fear she couldn't manage, and a truth she wasn't ready to face. The footage played without sound. Victoria stood frozen in front of the monitors, her reflection faintly layered over the black and white images. Timestamps flickered in the corner as the scene unfolded again. Slow, merciless, undeniable. There was her mother, standing small near the entrance, hands clenched around her purse, shoulders drawn inward, bracing for something unkind. Victoria's breath caught. Then Mark appeared on screen. Too close, too sharp, his gestures abrupt, dismissive. Victoria watched her mother's head lower, just slightly. A familiar motion, one she'd seen as a child, when Margaret tried not to make trouble in places that felt too loud, too fast. Victoria's jaw tightened. Then Ethan entered the frame. He moved carefully, respectfully, offered a glass of water, stood between Mark and her mother, not aggressively, but firmly, like a man who had already learned what it meant to protect someone smaller than himself. Victoria felt something twist in her chest. The video jumped forward. She saw her mother being escorted out, saw Ethan hand over his money, saw him flag down a taxi. And then, the door swung open, her coat, her posture, her voice. Victoria watched herself step into the frame, cool and distant, eyes sharp with judgment. She didn't need the audio. She remembered every word. "We're not a charity, turn in your apron." She saw Ethan fold the apron carefully. No anger, no argument, just quiet dignity. Victoria's hand flew to her mouth. "That was me," she whispered. Shame washed over her, hot and relentless. She had prided herself on efficiency, on fairness, on never letting emotion cloud judgment. And yet, here it was. Proof that she had become exactly what she claimed to despise. She had fired the one person who showed her mother kindness. Victoria stepped back from the screens, heart pounding, her perfectly constructed world cracking at the seams. Somewhere in the city, her mother was alone. Somewhere else, a man she dismissed was walking home to a sick child with nothing. Victoria straightened, resolve hardening beneath the guilt. This wasn't over. Not even close. Victoria didn't hesitate. She left the security room with purpose, her heels striking the marble floor in a sharp, steady rhythm that silenced conversations before she even spoke. Mark scrambled behind her, pale now, his earlier confidence drained from his face. "Everyone," Victoria said, stopping at the center of the dining room. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Forks paused midair, glasses lowered. The jazz music faded into an awkward hush. "I need your attention." She gestured to the large display screen usually reserved for private events. With a nod to the technician, the footage began to play. The room shifted. Guests watched as the scene unfolded. The elderly woman at the door, Mark's dismissive posture, the way no one intervened. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Then Ethan appeared on screen, offering water, standing his ground, quietly paying the price for his compassion. A few people looked down. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The final clip played. Victoria herself, cold, decisive, firing him. The screen went dark. "This," Victoria said, turning to face the room, "is what happened tonight, in my restaurant." She turned to Mark. "You abused your authority," she said evenly. "You humiliated a guest. You punished an employee for showing basic decency." Mark opened his mouth. "Ms. Hale, I was only—" "Enough," Victoria said. She reached into her pocket, removed her phone, and placed it on the table between them. "You're terminated, effective immediately." A collective breath was released. Victoria turned back to the room. Silver Crown was built on the promise of excellence. But excellence without humanity is empty. She paused, eyes scanning the faces around her. And tonight, she added quietly, we failed. Her gaze drifted toward the entrance, toward the street where Ethan had walked away. Someone find him, Victoria said firmly, now. Because the truth had finally been seen, and it demanded to be answered. Ethan was halfway down the block when his phone rang again. This time it wasn't Lily. Mr. Carter, a woman's voice said, clipped and urgent. This is the emergency department at St. Mary's. Your daughter was brought in 10 minutes ago. Severe asthma attack. The world narrowed to a single sound, his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. I'm coming, Ethan said, already running. I'm on my way. He didn't remember the streets he crossed, only the cold air tearing at his lungs as if it were mocking him. He arrived breathless, palms slick with sweat, chest tight with a terror he couldn't outrun. Inside the ER, everything was too bright, too fast. Lily lay on a gurney behind glass, small and pale, a mask strapped over her face. Her chest rose in shallow, uneven bursts. A monitor beeped in a rhythm that felt wrong. I'm here, Ethan whispered, pressing his hand to the glass. Daddy's here. A nurse approached, gentle but firm. We need to start additional treatment. Do you have insurance? Ethan froze. I just lost my job, he said, the words tasting like failure. Please, she needs help. The nurse hesitated. We'll do what we can, but do everything. The voice came from behind him. Victoria Hale stepped forward, coat unbuttoned, hair pulled back hastily, eyes sharp with focus, not judgment. She didn't look at Ethan at first. She placed her card on the counter. Whatever she needs, Victoria said. I'm covering it. Ethan turned, stunned. You don't have to. I know, Victoria said quietly, finally meeting his eyes. But I should have earlier. Doctors move faster. Orders were given. The room filled with purposeful motion. Ethan sank into a chair, hands shaking. Victoria sat beside him, not speaking, simply staying. Minutes stretched into an hour. Finally, a doctor emerged. She's stable, he said. It was close, but she's breathing on her own now. Ethan broke. He covered his face, shoulders collapsing under relief and exhaustion. Victoria watched him, heart heavy, knowing this night had drawn a line neither of them would ever cross back over again. The hospital room was quiet in the way only late nights could be, machines humming softly, fluorescent lights dimmed just enough to feel merciful. Lily slept curled on her side, an oxygen tube resting beneath her nose, her small chest rising and falling in a steady, reassuring rhythm. Ethan sat beside her bed, one hand wrapped around hers, afraid to let go as if she might drift away again. His eyes were red, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion, but there was relief there too, deep and overwhelming. She's strong, a gentle voice said behind him. Ethan turned to see Margaret Hale standing in the doorway, a cardigan pulled close around her thin frame. Her eyes were tired but warm. She stepped forward slowly, careful not to wake Lily. She gets that from her dad, Margaret added softly. Ethan swallowed. I'm sorry, he said, unsure why the words came out that way. About earlier. I didn't know who you were. Margaret shook her head. You knew exactly who I was, she said. Someone who needed help. She reached into her pocket and placed a small silver pendant on the table, a simple piece worn smooth with time. My husband gave me this years ago, she said. I think Lily should have it, just until she's better. Ethan hesitated. I can't. You already have, Margaret replied gently. Across the room, Victoria watched them, arms crossed loosely, her expression no longer guarded. She had spent her life building walls, around her business, her reputation, herself. Tonight she saw what those walls had kept out. I owe you more than an apology, Victoria said quietly to Ethan. I fired you because you reminded me of something I'd forgotten. What's that? Ethan asked. That people aren't line items, she replied. They're stories. She took a breath. When you're ready, I want you back at Silver Crown, not as a server, as someone who helps shape what we stand for. Ethan looked at Lily, then back at Victoria. I don't need power, he said. I just need stability, for her. Victoria nodded. Then let's build it the right way. As Lily stirred and squeezed Ethan's finger in her sleep, something unspoken settled between them all. Not a deal, not forgiveness, but the beginning of something honest. 3 months later, the morning light spilled through the wide windows of Silver Crown in a way it never had before. Softer, warmer, less concerned with appearances. The place still gleamed, still carried the quiet confidence of success. But something fundamental had shifted beneath the polish. Ethan Carter stood near the entrance, not in a server's uniform this time, but in a simple blazer that fit him comfortably. He wasn't trying to look important. He didn't need to. His presence did that on its own now. Steady, grounded, earned. On the wall behind the host stand hung a small framed note, handwritten and unassuming. People first, always. It had been Lily's idea. Lily herself sat at a nearby table with crayons and paper, coloring between sips of apple juice. Her cheeks were pink with health, her laughter light and fearless. The inhaler rested in Ethan's pocket now, not as a source of panic, but as a precaution, a reminder of how close they'd come and how far they'd move forward. Across the room, Victoria Hale watched them quietly. She'd spent years believing success was about control, about precision, margins, and outcomes. But standing there now, she understood something she'd missed her entire career. Real leadership wasn't about never making mistakes. It was about what you did the moment you realized you were wrong. Silver Crown had changed. Staff were trained differently. Guests noticed. Reviews mentioned something new. Warmth, humanity, heart. And it all traced back to one small moment. One glass of water. One choice made by a tired father who had nothing left to give, except decency. Ethan knelt beside Lily's table. "Ready to go, Peanut?" She nodded enthusiastically, then paused. "Daddy? Yeah? Are we still helping people here?" Ethan smiled. "Yeah," he said, "we are." As they walked toward the door, Victoria joined them. "Thank you," she said, not as a CEO, not as a boss, but as a person who had learned something essential. Ethan nodded. No speeches, no grand gestures. Some lessons didn't need applause. Outside, the city moved on. Busy, loud, imperfect. But inside Silver Crown, something quiet and powerful had taken root. Proof that kindness wasn't weakness, that dignity didn't have a price tag, that the smallest act could change the direction of many lives. So let me ask you, if you were Ethan, would you have done the same thing? Would you risk everything you had for a stranger who needed help? And if someone showed you that kind of compassion, would you recognize it when it mattered most? If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the power of empathy in a world that often forgets it, please subscribe to the channel and stay with us. More stories like this are coming, stories about ordinary people, impossible choices, and the quiet courage that changes everything. Because sometimes the most valuable thing you can offer is simply being human.